I stood at the altar, heart pounding, eyes locked onto the woman I thought would be my forever. Emily looked radiant, her white gown flowing like something out of a dream. My best friend, Jason, stood beside me as my best man, grinning like he had been born for this role. We exchanged vows, and when Emily said, "I do," I felt invincible. My life was set, love, friendship, and a future carved in stone. But sometimes, the things we carve are meant to be shattered. The reception was a blur of laughter, clinking glasses, and whispered promises. I watched Emily dance under the soft glow of fairy lights, twirling in Jason's arms. It was innocent, I told myself. Just a dance. Then she disappeared. At first, I thought she had gone to fix her makeup, maybe to take a breath after all the excitement. But 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The smile on my face tightened, muscles burning from forcing an expression that no longer felt real. "Seen Emily?" I asked Jason when he returned to the bar, adjusting his tie. He hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. My stomach twisted. She, said she was feeling a little overwhelmed. "Probably in the bridal suite," he said, gulping down his drink in one go. I nodded, pushing down the unease curling inside me. But as I walked through the quiet corridors of the hotel, my shoes clicking against the polished marble, dread took hold of me. I reached our suite. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, muffled sounds. A laugh, hers. A breathless, low murmur, his. I pushed the door open, and there they were. My best friend. My wife. Tangled in a betrayal that hit me harder than any punch I had ever taken. For a moment, the world stopped. The taste of champagne turned to acid in my throat. My hands trembled, not with sadness, but with something darker. Something lethal. Jason's face drained of color. Emily gasped, clutching the sheets around her, but there was no use. Nothing could cover the truth of what they had done. A slow, cruel smile spread across my lips. "Don't stop on my account," I said, voice eerily calm. "After all, it's still our wedding night." Jason scrambled out of bed, fumbling for his clothes. "It's not what it looks like." "Oh, shut up," I snapped, the ice in my veins spreading. Emily reached for me. "James, please, I can explain now." I laughed so hard it echoed in the suite, the sound of a man who had just lost everything and found something far worse in its place. Revenge. I turned on my heel and walked out, leaving behind the wreckage of a love I once believed in. They thought this was over. They had no idea it was only the beginning. I didn't go back to the reception. What was the point? Instead, I walked out of the hotel, letting the night air bite at my skin as I made my way to my car. My wedding suit felt like a costume now, a joke that everyone had been in on except me. I sat behind the wheel, gripping it so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind replayed the scene in the bridal suite over and over again, each repetition adding another layer of fury, another wave of ice-cold detachment. I should have been devastated, should have felt my heart splintering into pieces, but all I felt was clarity, a dangerous, sharp-edged kind of clarity. The kind that turns men into monsters. I exhaled, slow and measured, staring out into the city lights. I could hear their laughter in my head, Jason and Emily, tangled together in a betrayal so vile it made my stomach churn. Jason, my best friend since childhood. Emily, the woman I swore to spend my life with. They had destroyed everything in the span of an hour. No hesitation. No remorse. I wondered how long it had been going on. Had it started before the wedding? Was I the fool they whispered about behind my back? Was every stolen glance, every lingering touch, a part of their deception? My fingers twitched against the leather of the steering wheel. For a fleeting moment, I considered driving away, leaving them to rot in their shame. Maybe that would have been the sensible thing to do, the path of a man who still had a trace of mercy left in his soul. But I wasn't that man anymore. Mercy was for those who deserved it, and neither of them did. They had made a mockery of me, humiliated me in the cruelest way possible. On my wedding night. My wedding night. No, walking away wasn't an option. Not for a man like me. Not after what they had done. I closed my eyes, breathing in the rage, letting it settle into something colder, something lethal. They thought they could destroy me and walk away unscathed. That was their first mistake. Their last mistake. I pulled out my phone, my thumb hovering over Jason's contact, but I didn't call. There was nothing left to say. Instead, I did something better. I sent him a message, short, simple, and laced with a quiet malice that I knew would haunt him for the rest of his miserable life. Enjoy tonight. It's your last one. I didn't wait for a reply. I didn't need one. The game had already begun. I sat in my car for what felt like an eternity, the weight of my own fury pressing down on me like a vice, each breath sharp and deliberate as my mind wove a plan from the scraps of my shattered heart. I wasn't a man driven by impulse. I was methodical, precise, the kind of man who never acted without thinking 5 steps ahead. That's why this disgusting, wretched betrayal burned more than anything. I should have seen it. I should have noticed the subtle shifts, the careful avoidance of eye contact between them when I entered a room, the way Jason had started to pull away from our friendship just enough to make it seem natural. I had mistaken it for the kind of drifting that happens as people grow older, never suspecting that he wasn't pulling away at all. He was just making space for my wife. My wife. The words felt like acid on my tongue now, a title that no longer belonged to Emily, if it ever had at all. I had loved her fiercely, blindly, the kind of love that forgives small faults and dismisses warning signs as paranoia. Love had made me a fool. But hate? Hate would make me a god. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my mind calculating every possible outcome. Revenge wasn't just about hurting them. It was about ensuring they suffered in a way that would leave scars, the kind that wouldn't heal. I wasn't interested in fleeting pain. I wanted something permanent, something they could never crawl out of. Death would be too easy, too merciful. No, I needed something worse. I needed to make them understand, to make them live with the consequences of what they had done, every single day for the rest of their miserable lives. I pulled out my phone again, this time scrolling through my contacts until I found a name I hadn't needed in years, a man whose existence I had buried when I chose to live a life of order instead of chaos. But some people never really disappear, and some debts are never fully paid. I tapped the name, my pulse steady, my decision absolute. The phone rang once. Twice. A deep voice answered, amused, curious. James. Been a long time. I exhaled, my lips curling into something that almost resembled a smile. Not long enough, I replied, my voice laced with something dark. I need a favor. The voice on the other end of the line carried a weight that most men feared, but I wasn't most men. I had walked away from this world once, back when I believed in things like loyalty and love, when I thought my life could be built on something stronger than violence. But standing in the wreckage of my own foolish optimism, I saw the truth now. Men like me didn't get fairy tales. We didn't get happy endings. We got war, destruction, the kind of justice that doesn't come in the form of courtroom settlements or tearful apologies. No, the only justice I could live with was the kind that bled, the kind that left scars as deep as the wounds they had given me. I had buried this part of myself for years, locked it away behind a facade of normalcy, but tonight, I reached for it like an old, familiar weapon, something I had once mastered and could wield again without hesitation. What kind of favor? The voice asked, its amusement fading into something more serious. I knew better than to waste his time, so I told him, plain and simple. I want them ruined, I said, and even I was surprised by the calm in my voice, the certainty in my words. There was a pause, a silence that stretched just long enough to let me know he was thinking, calculating the weight of my request. That's a broad term, he finally said. You want them gone? Or do you want them to suffer? I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the question settle deep inside me, and when I opened them, the answer was already carved into my bones. I want them to lose everything, I said, my voice like steel. I want them to wake up every day knowing their lives are in freefall, that every piece of security they've ever clung to has been ripped away. I want them to feel the walls closing in, the ground crumbling beneath their feet. And when there's nothing left, when they're desperate, broken, and afraid, I want them to know that it was me. The silence that followed was different this time, heavier, almost reverent. You always did have a taste for the poetic, he said at last, a small chuckle laced with something darker. I'll need names. I didn't hesitate. Emily Grayson. Jason Carter. The names felt like venom on my tongue, but speaking them aloud made it real, solidified my purpose. Grayson and Carter, he repeated, as if rolling them over in his mind, measuring their worth. This isn't going to be cheap. I let out a slow breath, forcing down the smirk that threatened to curl my lips. You still owe me, I reminded him, my voice quieter now, edged with something dangerous. Another pause, this one carrying the weight of memory of old debts and darker times. That I do, he admitted. Consider it paid. And just like that, the deal was set. There were no drawn-out discussions, no negotiations. When you operated in the kind of circles I used to run in, deals were made in shadows and sealed with unspoken understanding. The call ended, and for the first time since I had walked in on my wife betraying me, I allowed myself to breathe. But it wasn't relief I felt, it was anticipation. The pieces were in motion now, and there was no turning back. I spent the rest of the night driving, letting the hum of the engine soothe the storm inside me. I didn't go home. Home didn't exist anymore. It had been tainted, poisoned by betrayal, turned into something unrecognizable. Instead, I found myself at the edge of the city, parked outside a small, run-down bar where the lights flickered like they were struggling to stay alive. It was the kind of place where people went to forget, where the weight of the world was drowned in cheap whiskey and regret. I stepped inside, the air thick with smoke and desperation, and ordered a drink I had no intention of savoring. I needed to clear my mind, to focus on what came next. The plan wasn't just about vengeance, it was about precision. Jason had always prided himself on being untouchable, on having the right connections, the right security to keep himself insulated from real consequences. And Emily? She had built her entire life on an illusion, the perfect wife, the perfect friend, the kind of woman who could smile in your face while stabbing you in the back. They had both spent years crafting their facades, but I was about to strip them down to nothing. Jason's weaknesses were easier to exploit, his arrogance, his addiction to power. He thrived on control, on being the man everyone looked up to, and that was exactly where I would hit him. I had enough dirt on him to burn his entire world to the ground, and with the right hands guiding the fire, it wouldn't be long before the foundation crumbled. Emily, on the other hand, required something more personal. She was vain, obsessed with status and appearances, and I would take that from her piece by piece. By the time I was done, she wouldn't just lose me, she would lose the life she had built, the image she had so carefully maintained. I would make sure that when she looked in the mirror, all she saw was the wreckage of her own choices. I took another sip of my drink, the burn barely registering as my mind worked through the logistics. There were no loose ends in my plans, there never had been. Every move I made was deliberate, every step calculated for maximum impact. By the time they realized what was happening, it would be too late. Their finances would be in ruins, their reputations destroyed. Jason would lose his career, his power, and Emily? Emily would lose everything she had ever valued. I wasn't just going to make them suffer, I was going to make them beg. As I sat in that dimly lit bar, the weight of what I had said in motion settled over me, but there was no regret, no second-guessing. I had loved Emily once, trusted Jason as my own brother, but love and trust were luxuries I could no longer afford. They had taken something from me that could never be replaced, and now I would take everything from them. When I finally left the bar, the night was still and quiet, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. I stepped into the darkness with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years, my hands steady, my mind clear. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about justice. And by the time I was finished, they would know exactly what kind of man they had crossed. The night stretched long and quiet as I drove aimlessly through the city, letting the streetlight smear across my windshield in long, golden streaks, my mind a storm of controlled chaos. There was something about the waiting that always gnawed at me, the hours before a plan took its first breath, before the pieces moved into place. But this wasn't just a plan, it was a reckoning. It was a slow, careful dismantling of everything Emily and Jason held dear, a methodical erasure of their lives as they knew them. I had no interest in quick satisfaction, no desire for a dramatic confrontation where I screamed at them, demanded answers, or let them crawl at my feet, begging for forgiveness that would never come. No, I wanted them to feel it in waves, for the ground beneath them to crack so slowly that by the time they realized they were sinking, there would be no lifeline, no way out. Their downfall had to be poetic, precise, drawn out like the slow bleed of a wound too deep to clot. And that was why I had called him Victor Delaney, a man whose debts to me ran deeper than any ocean, a man who, for the right reasons, could make someone disappear without ever laying a hand on them. He was an architect of destruction, the kind of person who built ruin the way others built skyscrapers, not with brute force but with whispers, signatures on the right documents, a few well-placed lies, and the gentle tugging of invisible strings. And I knew that once he had their names, their lives would unravel like loose thread from a fraying tapestry, one careless pull at a time. I didn't go home. I didn't sleep. Instead, I parked in the shadows near Jason's apartment, watching the glow of lights flickering behind his heavy curtains, my stomach twisting in revulsion at the thought of Emily being in there with him, wrapped in sheets that weren't ours, lying in a bed that didn't belong to her, whispering things in the dark that she had once whispered to me. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the casualness of it, the ease with which they had thrown me away like I had never mattered, as if the years we had spent together, the promises made, the life built, had all been nothing more than a fragile illusion that dissolved the moment my back was turned. They hadn't even waited. The wedding vows were still warm on her lips when she let him touch her. That thought settled deep in my chest, cold and solid, fueling the quiet rage simmering just beneath my skin. But rage alone was useless. It burned hot and reckless, destroyed without precision. What I needed was something colder, sharper, something that wouldn't just break them, but leave them knowing, in every waking moment, that they had brought this upon themselves. By morning, the first thread had been pulled. Jason was too arrogant to see it coming, too confident in his untouchable status to realize that the foundation beneath him had already begun to shift. Victor worked fast, as he always did. A call here, an anonymous tip there, and suddenly, Jason's name was tied to an internal investigation at his firm, whispers of financial discrepancies, of conflicts of interest that couldn't be ignored. It wasn't enough to take him down. Not yet, but it planted the seed, put the eyes of the right people on him. And once those eyes were watching, it was only a matter of time before they started finding things that weren't even there. People in Jason's world didn't survive scandals. They were like sharks, feeding off each other's downfall, waiting for the scent of blood in the water. And I had just made sure the first drop had fallen. Emily would take longer. Her destruction couldn't be corporate. It had to be personal. She had built herself into the image of the perfect wife, the perfect friend, the woman with the flawless life. I needed to crack that image from the inside out. And so, as Jason's world began to tremble beneath him, I turned my focus to Emily, starting with the one thing she valued more than anything, her reputation. It began subtly, a social media leak here, a carefully crafted rumor there, a slow poisoning of her name in the circles she held so dear. A trusted friend suddenly turning cold, an invitation rescinded without explanation, sideways glances at gatherings where she was used to being adored. And then, the pictures. I had found them easily, buried deep in her hidden folders, thinking she had been so clever, so careful. Pictures of her and Jason, time-stamped from months before the wedding, intimate, undeniable. I sent them out in waves. First, a few to her closest friends, the ones who whispered in private but never confronted in public, then a few more to the people in her professional life. Just enough to let the rumors fester, to let the questions hang in the air unspoken. And finally, the last, most brutal strike. A direct message to her parents, the people she had spent her entire life trying to impress, accompanied by a simple caption. This is who your daughter really is. I didn't need to be there to see the fallout. I could already imagine it perfectly. The frantic phone calls, the tearful denials, the desperate explanations that would fall on deaf ears. The silent judgment of those who had once adored her, the coldness of a world that had no use for fallen queens. Emily had always thrived on the admiration of others, had built her self-worth on the reflection of how others saw her. And now, that reflection was shattered. I knew the exact moment it hit her. My phone vibrated in my pocket as I sat in a quiet cafe, sipping coffee as the city moved around me, indifferent to the chaos I had unleashed. Emily, please. We need to talk. I need to explain. I let the message sit, unread, untouched, a silent confirmation that she no longer had access to me, to the man she had betrayed so easily. And then, a second message, this one from Jason. You did this. I know it was you. A slow smile curled at the edges of my lips as I stared at the screen, watching the words he had sent me, his anger seething between the lines. Good, I thought. Let him know. Let him feel it. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Their suffering had only just begun. Their worlds were still intact, still standing, but they were no longer stable. Every pillar they had leaned on was beginning to splinter, every illusion they had spun around themselves unraveling one by one. Soon, Jason would find himself unhireable, a liability rather than an asset. Emily would find herself alone, ostracized, stripped of the social status she had once wielded like a weapon. And then, only then, when there was nothing left for them to cling to, when they had fallen as far as they could possibly go, I would give them the final blow. Because revenge wasn't about anger. It wasn't about getting even. It was about teaching them a lesson they would never forget. And I was only just getting started. The days passed, and the weight of their destruction began pressing down on them like an avalanche they couldn't outrun. Jason was the first to stumble, his once flawless confidence beginning to crack as whispers turned into allegations, and allegations turned into something he could no longer control. His firm had officially opened an internal investigation, and though he had yet to be fired, he was on leave, suspended from his position until the matter was resolved. But Jason was no fool. He knew the nature of corporate wolves. They weren't investigating to exonerate him. They were looking for the most efficient way to cut him loose, to sever their ties before his corruption became theirs. I imagined him sitting alone in his expensive apartment, his phone ringing with calls from once loyal colleagues who now spoke in hushed tones, distancing themselves as if he were contagious. His name was toxic now, his power slipping through his fingers like sand. Emily fared no better. Her world, once curated so perfectly, had turned on her with the same cold indifference she had once shown me. The friends she had once controlled like chess pieces were no longer returning her calls, her invitations were being revoked, and the social circles she had basked in had quietly shut their doors in her face. The betrayal wasn't just that she had been unfaithful, it was that she had been careless, stupid enough to get caught, foolish enough to let her perfect image shatter in the eyes of those who mattered most to her. And the worst part? She didn't even know the full extent of what was coming. She thought this was the worst of it, thought that she had been dragged through the fire and was now only waiting for the embers to cool. But she didn't realize that I had barely begun. I received another message from her. James, I don't know what you've heard, but please talk to me. This isn't what you think. I made a mistake, but I never stopped loving you. Please, let me explain. Love. That word used to mean something to me, used to anchor me, but now it felt hollow, like an echo of a language I no longer spoke. You made a mistake, Emily? I wanted to reply. No, you made a choice. And now, you live with it. But I didn't say anything. Silence was far crueler. Let her scream into the void. Let her drown in the emptiness of knowing I was watching her fall and doing nothing to save her. I watched from a distance as their desperation took root, as the walls closed in around them. Jason had started drinking more. The once sharp, controlled businessman now a man unraveling at the seams, lashing out at the few people who still tolerated his presence. Emily, on the other hand, had tried to salvage her reputation, attempted to spin a narrative where she was the victim, a woman who had made a mistake but had been unfairly punished for it. But no one was buying it. She had built her life on perception, and once that was gone, there was nothing left for her to stand on. That was when I decided it was time. The final blow had to be something irreversible, something they couldn't recover from. Jason's career was hanging by a thread, but that wasn't enough. I needed him humiliated, stripped of every ounce of pride he had ever possessed. And for Emily, I needed her to feel what I had felt. Betrayed. Alone. Forgotten. I made sure Jason's name was directly tied to the financial scandal I had orchestrated, ensuring that his firing wouldn't just be a quiet dismissal, but a public disgrace. His accounts were frozen, his assets seized pending further investigation. The world he had built for himself, the luxury, the influence, it was gone in an instant. His downfall wasn't just professional, it was personal. No firm would touch him now. No one would want to be associated with him. He had been exiled from the world he once ruled. And then, there was Emily. I waited for the perfect moment, watching as she clung to Jason, the only person she had left, the man she had chosen over me. And then I made sure she lost him too. It started with an anonymous tip to the press, a well-placed leak that painted Jason as the mastermind behind a fraudulent scheme, one that implicated Emily as well. The media pounced, the story gaining traction overnight. She had thought her reputation had been salvaged, that she could claw her way back into the life she had lost, but I made sure that wasn't possible. Now, she wasn't just a woman who had an affair, she was complicit in a scandal, a woman whose hands were just as dirty as Jason's. And Jason? He wasn't built for loyalty. I watched it unfold like a beautifully orchestrated tragedy. The moment he realized she was a liability, the moment he understood that standing by her meant dragging himself further into the abyss, he did exactly what I knew he would. He left her. I imagined the scene, the screaming, the tears, the desperate begging. But Jason was a survivor, and survivors don't hold on to dead weight. He turned his back on her just as easily as she had turned her back on me, and for the first time, Emily felt what it was like to be discarded. Emily reached out again, but this time, her words were different. I know it was you. I know what you did. I smiled as I read the message. imagining the rage behind her words, the helplessness of knowing she couldn't stop what was happening. You took everything from me. Are you happy now? I thought about that for a long moment. Happiness? No, this wasn't about happiness. It was about balance. About justice. Emily and Jason had taken something from me that could never be returned. But now, they knew what that felt like. Now, they would carry the same scars I did. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. In the end, they disappeared. Jason fled the city, his name a stain he couldn't erase. He had no job, no influence, no future. Last I heard, he was scraping by, a shadow of the man he once was. And Emily? She lost everything. Her home, her reputation, her standing. She tried to rebuild, but the world she had once thrived in had moved on without her. The last time I saw her, she was working a job far beneath the life she once held, her face worn, her eyes hollow. She looked through me as if I were a ghost, as if she knew, deep down, that I had done this to her, but couldn't bring herself to admit it. I walked past her without a word, leaving her to drown in the life she had chosen. And as I stepped into the sunlight, I realized something. It was over. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free.